Do Vietnamese really eat dogs? Quick answer, yes. With 97 million people in Vietnam at the time of this video, it's safe to say that not most Vietnamese eat dog. Yet Vietnam is the second largest consumer of dog meat. And this does raise the question similar to KFC on where they're getting all their chickens. Where is Vietnam getting all these dogs? The dogs eaten in Vietnam are not always from Vietnam. Vietnam is the second largest importer of dogs for the means of consumption, which typically come from Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. In 2022, the demand started to increase heavily on the Cambodian border, to the point where Cambodia was actually restricting and stopping the importing of dogs to Vietnam. As per the reports, they started to realize that these dogs weren't being imported as domestic pets, but as food. The idea of eating dogs started back in Korea during the Korean War, and Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And after the war was over, Korea made this very illegal, to the point where nobody really does anymore in Korea, but Vietnam has kept the tradition for say alive, even though it's illegal. But it's also illegal to throw trash on the ground, and we see how that's going. The rise of eating dogs in Vietnam started during the Vietnam War, but it's important to be aware that this was way before the American and Russian entanglement started in the country. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of reports were talking about this was due to oppression from the West. But none of these reports ever talked about the heights of dog consumption in Vietnam was during this time. It was actually before this time, as it's more of a belief system and there's reasons behind it. So to understand why Vietnamese are eating dogs in 2023, and it's not because of oppression, it's because of a cultural difference that we would have in the West. Now, I do have to say this before we dive into this rabbit hole that's going to get quite dark. This is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people. Living here in Asia, all of Asia, for over a decade, I've learned that no meat, food, or bones go to waste. This goes from everything out here in Vietnam as well, where the bones are used for broth to make pho. The organs are used to add flavor and texture to different dishes out here in Vietnam. And not to mention the Chinese medicine theories that go on. But the point being is nothing is ever wasted. And I do also want to say what we're going to talk about today is illegal in Vietnam. It's been illegal for a while, but it is still accepted by a lot. So it's good to understand the culture difference, as this isn't inhumane and it's not always considered bad in the culture. Now, to give you a caveat, because I know a lot of people are seeing this now and they're freaking out, a lot of the new generation are no longer doing this. They're actually adopting the idea of keeping dogs and cats in their house as pets. It is becoming a bigger trend. And the consumption is really with the older generation. So with that warning out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the consumption all around Vietnam. Now, the first thing we got to do is cut the stigma that the North does this more or the South does this more. This is a very balanced thing. There is this idea that it's the other side that always does this. If you ask a Saigon person who eats dogs in Vietnam, they're always going to say the North does, and they're bad for this. But if you go to Hanoi and you ask who eats dogs in Vietnam, they're going to say Saigon does, and they're bad for this. You see where I'm going. Accountability in Vietnam it's really not part of the culture. So the balance of who eats dog more or less, it's rather balanced. Now, in regards to actually finding dog, I will say Saigon is more hidden about it, where it's a little harder to find, to the point to where you have to call in advance to different restaurants, or you just need to know somebody that does this. This isn't something you just walk into a restaurant and be like, let me get some fries and a dog. Now, when it comes to North Vietnam, it's a little different. If you've lived out there, you know there's a lot of countryside. I'm not just talking about Hanoi. There's a lot of North Vietnam. It's a big area. And when you get to the countryside, it is actually quite common to see dog meat barbecued, cooked, and hung in a lot of the street markets and wet markets that you'll see out there. Way more common in North Vietnam than you see in the South. And that just comes down to North Vietnam has way more farms in the middle of nowhere, making it much harder to regulate what people are doing and what laws can actually be enforced. And if you've lived in these countrysides in North Vietnam, you'll know that there is an overpopulation of dogs. When you start talking to locals, it kind of frustrates them. And on top of that, with farms starting to have less yield in their farms, finding food is becoming a lot harder in these areas. Places like Lai Châu and Lao Cai, they're exporting more food to Hanoi and Saigon, so they're left with less food, so their only options are becoming very limited. And when there's a surplus of dogs running around, you can kind of put one and one together. And this reminds me of when I used to live in Lao Cai and Lai Châu. This is like the outside cities and the stop is in the middle. It was very common to see dog heads on butcher boards. It was very common to see, this is like, I'm a dog lover, so this is hard to say a lot of stuff. But you'll see dogs that are cut open and spread and hung out and barbecued. This type of stuff is quite normal in these parts. The point being though is, are dogs eaten more in the north or the south? It's kind of a mutual thing. So the idea that dogs are eaten here in Vietnam is more of a cultural thing, to where in the West, we see dogs more as like friends and family to us, right? I grew up with Husky, and it was family. You would never dare hit your dog. Like, this is what it was. But speaking of the West and their laws with this stuff, places like Hoi An have made a lot of public programs where they enforce the protection of dogs' rights, and this includes cats as well, to where if it's caught or seen, people get in a lot of trouble for doing it. I don't even know if the rules are working. It's just, Hoi An is known to have the best animal rights, I guess is the word. It's not really a word in Vietnam, but you know what I mean. And we know how laws are in Vietnam. Like, it's illegal to drive on the sidewalk. It's illegal to text while you're driving in Vietnam. It really is. It's in the government Hanoi laws. But how many times do you see somebody driving around on the sidewalk, I don't know, watching YouTube videos or actually playing a game? Like, it's so common. So laws they're in the book, but they rarely get followed. When tourists hear about this, or if they even see it, which you can't see this, it's always the same question: why? And I want to make this very clear. Eating dog in Vietnam isn't the same as eating chicken and beef. Like, it's not consumed to that level. It is eaten for purpose for most people. But for those times that it isn't eaten for purpose, that we're going to get into here in a minute, it is common to see dog meat on those kebab meat sticks, where it'll be dog meat, beef, and lamb kind of put on their barbecue. That is actually quite common, to the point where a lot of people don't even know they are eating dog. And the reason for this is it's much cheaper than beef or lamb. Now, other places you see dog meat eaten are at traditional weddings. And I'm not talking about at a wedding chapel. Like, the dog eating typically happens at the houses. So let me explain a Vietnamese wedding to you real quick, because I think most people that watch this video that are not Vietnamese, you've been to a wedding. Vietnam weddings are in 3 stages. Typically, the first day of the wedding is at the house. This is where it's kind of like friends and family. Everyone gets together. It's usually a really big, let's get drunk out of our mind kind of a party. Let's celebrate, let's have fun, and let's give the gifts to the bride and groom, stuff like that. The second day, typically in the morning, is when the final wedding pictures are taken before they head off to the chapel. The chapel is where you see the 3-course meal wedding. The bride and groom on the stage doing their thing, like the traditional side of the wedding that you would see like in the West even. And then day 3, or stage 3 rather, is the night party. The night party is kind of where the dog consumption comes in, if it does. And there are reasons for that. Again, we're gonna get into that here real fast, actually. Usually after the chapel, they go home, and this part of the party is typically just the bride, the groom, and only close family. You don't really see this in like Saigon or Hanoi, like the main cities. This is outside the countryside. Like if you're out in like Phan Thiet or Dalat, or if you're in like Lai Châu, Sapa even. Like places like that are gonna be where you see this more often than you would in the city. So past the weddings and the street vendor food that'll be sneaking dog onto your like kebab sticks, why else do Vietnamese eat dog? So number 1 is an interesting one, but it's for sexual benefit. Guys believe that eating dog will help improve the stamina, but it'll also improve the chances of having a son instead of a daughter. The second one is a more common one in Vietnam, and it's about the medical properties. It has some kind of healing properties to it that helps your body heal better and get healthier and be stronger. The third one is more based on Chinese medicine and yin yang and theory like that, where dog is considered a hot food. Now, I don't mean hot as in like warm. I'm gonna say if you eat cold dog, there's something else that happens. There's different versions. I'll put some on the screen here for you guys to kind of see what I'm talking about. But in Vietnam, there's this belief that stems from China, where there's different foods that are hot foods, there's cold foods. So if you eat a balance of hot and cold foods, your qi, your yin yang is balanced. And a dog is considered a hot food. And the last one, number 4, is eating dog brings good luck to the family. This is usually a family event. This isn't just the guy. This is the entire family typically eating dog as part of their meals. And the idea is that it brings good fortune to the family and it brings good luck. Now this one though, it typically happens on more of a holiday situation, like Chinese New Year or Tet, whatever you want to call it. where they believe if they eat dog on this day, these 3 holidays, that the luck in the family and the good fortune will raise a lot more. Vietnamese do not feel like dog meat is like a normal food. You're not gonna go to a restaurant and order some rice and dog. Vietnamese don't eat dog like that. And I see this complaint a lot from the Vietnamese side where they get upset where Western people think that they just eat dog all day. This isn't what it is. Again, this is typically for medicine or tradition or beliefs or culture reasons that dog's eaten. Don't be surprised if dog is kind of mixed in with your meat, and you might not even notice it either because they cook it like they'd cook beef. If you ate dog, it's not gonna kill you. But it is something to be aware of. This is a very rare thing in Vietnam in magnitude compared to any other meats in Vietnam. There are times and reasons for this. I mean, granted, there's gonna be people, like we talked about earlier, in the farm areas where they're gonna be eating it a lot more, maybe even daily. But this leads us to the next thing that I saw as a common question online. Do Vietnamese do this all over the world? Now, eating dog in Vietnam is a cultural thing, meaning when the older generation move abroad, they typically bring their traditions with them. There's a little town out in Tokyo, it's called Little Saigon. This is actually quite common to happen out there, and during the pandemic, this was a big problem. But again, this is the older generation, so don't think if your neighbor's Vietnamese that they're just gonna come over and take your poodle and microwave it. It's not like that. Growing up in a Vietnamese community my entire life in America, I never saw anybody eat dog. Growing up, they used to always joke like, oh, that's what the Chinese do. And my Chinese friends always be like, that's what Vietnamese do. But I never saw anybody doing it. I don't think abroad this really happens as much as like the media might portray it, but it does happen. It really stems down to the older generation. The younger generation in Vietnam isn't typically doing this. It happens. It is typically with the older generation. So the younger generation typically aren't doing this. They are more pet friendly. I think a lot of you guys have probably left a lot of comments. You're upset, you're angry. This isn't true. It's all in the north, it's all in the south. I get all that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get down to the stats. So when it comes to eating dog, Vietnam is number 2 most consuming country next to China, being number 1. And like we've talked about before, it's a common food with beer. You'll see this happening at weddings, and then going out to like farm areas and whatnot, you will see this as being more of a normal thing than you would in the city life. The stats of this is about 55 to 60% of dog consumption happens in North Vietnam, where about 35 to 40% happens in the south, and the difference is kind of in the center. And there's also been another trend since 2020 that's been going on lately, and that's fake dog meat. And this is typically something that's made of pork feet and spices and whatnot that are typically used to cook dog meat. And the idea of this is they're just trying to make the pork taste like dog without actually having to sacrifice the dog. It sounds like the demand is still there, because just making a fake version means that people are still kind of craving the real version, right? I don't know, to me it sounds like a vegan that eats like vegan veggie burgers. Like they haven't accepted they're a vegan and made it part of the lifestyle, and they're making it feel like they're sacrificing something. So they're trying to eat like fake meat. I don't know where this is gonna go with that. But in more positive news, the pet culture in Vietnam is starting to grow and is growing. So the younger generation are starting to adopt the idea of having pets in their home and raising them as part of their family. And this is a really good thing until you start digging into what's actually happening. As somebody that is a pet owner my entire life, this kind of frustrates me a little. So let's go into what actually happens. It's becoming a trend to buy bigger, expensive Western style dogs. For example, buying Huskies or buying those like long hot dog dogs that never shut up. I don't know the name of them, but those are starting to become more popular dogs to buy out here in Vietnam. And they're becoming so popular, there's on average 1 million registered pets per year in all of Vietnam. That's huge. But there is an issue that comes with this that I've noticed. The more expensive the dog is, which typically is most of the time if they're Western dogs, the more they're abused or neglected even. Common things that I've seen is a lot with Huskies. Huskies are actually a high demand dog in Vietnam because they're big and they're expensive. And come on, man, it's a Husky, man. Unfortunately, the animal abuse is becoming a very big thing. And it's starting to seem that the more expensive the dog is, the more it's treated bad. It's not taken care of. And common things that I've seen, like living in different parts of Vietnam over the last decade, Huskies have always been something I've seen out here. But unfortunately, I've seen them where they're chained to walls. Like the chain is just like, like it's like a foot long, where they just pretty much sit there days on end. I've seen like the little poodle dogs where they just like, they spray paint them and do weird stuff to them, take them out, and then they just kind of like throw them in the back of the car kind of a thing. I don't mean to laugh, it's the painting that always confused me. It's like they doll them up to impress somebody. And then the neglect and the abuse when the dogs are actually hungry. The amount of times I've seen people out here just like kick the hell out of their dogs because they're hungry, it is rather insane. When I lived out in a little small town, there was this guy next to me, he had a husky in there. Dude, it was just like, I ended up going over there like once a day feeding him. Like, it was just like, they abused the hell out of him. Kicked him. Every time he cried, they kicked him. And I don't think people understand, like, huskies are they're very demanding dogs. Like, I grew up with huskies, and if you leave them alone in the house for like 2 days, nobody there, they're gonna destroy everything because they go crazy. So to have a husky and chain it to a wall in the back of your house and ignore it for like 3 days is really like mentally destructive to these types of dogs. And this kind of stuff happens a lot. The reason for like that more expensive dogs is it's a status thing. If you have a husky, or if you have like a golden retriever, if you have a poodle or something like that, it gives you this portray that to your friends that you're rich. Like, oh, I have this expensive Western dog. I don't take care of it, but I have this expensive dog. So it's definitely a status thing to look rich, as they say out here. But on top of that, though, I don't want to make it sound like all Vietnamese just beat their dog and neglect them. Like, it's not like that. When I was out in Hanoi last week, there's a huge dog culture out there, and they had like little dog shows. Like, Vietnamese really, in general, take care of their pets. And like I said, 1 million registered a year is insane. Think about it, 97 million. And this stat I got from, it started back in 2015. So that's already been like 8 million. So like 7 or 8% of this population has registered dogs or cats as pets. That's really cool. The trend of abuse and like a means of food is slowly starting to wage off to where it's not something that we see anymore out here. Or at least it's not something acceptable by a lot of people. So there is still hope for good things for dogs out here. And yeah, I'm thinking by 2100, we'll be good to go, because things out here seem to take forever. And all the newer generation is really taking a left turn. They're going more westernized when it comes to dogs and cats, and domesticating them and creating pets instead of creating a lunch meal. Either way, I put a link below for you guys, for the guys that want to really look into this. There's an in-depth report that was done some time ago where a group of reporters went through a Hanoi market, and they were looking at the wet markets of Hanoi and going over the animal abuse that goes way beyond dogs. So dogs, cats, like just everything that has life in Vietnam is pretty much a food option in some of these wet markets, and they go into. So check the link below if you want to know more about that stuff. Either way, I'm gonna get out of here, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again.